Hey everyone, I am going to do some reading from Tamara Ferguson's Two Hearts, Unspoken Targets. Prologue. October 2014, Iraq. The squadron was finally going home. Air Force Lieutenant Josh Logan watched his fellow crewmen begin assembling, climbing into their one-man cockpits as he stepped into his own. After the bombs had been dropped on Kobani, each flight team had returned to the isolated airfield, serving as temporary headquarters for their hand-picked elite unit. They were in a protected zone, and the Iraqi government had sanctioned the U.S. occupation of the former airbase. "Begin to assemble Flight Team 1, blasted out through the intercom set up near the rundown control tower. Slightly smaller than usual, the 12-bomber squadron had been divided into 3 flight teams for this special mission. Each bomber would be departing from the field in 15-minute intervals. Now that their primary mission had been completed, pilots from another squadron would be arriving later in the day to take their place. "Flight Team 2, be ready," Captain Jason Matthews called out to his other men. Manned by Hawk Benton, Team 1's first F-22 Raptor made it down the runway safely and was easing along the short-track strip in preparation for takeoff before disaster struck. Gunfire echoed suddenly through the air, and the insurgents seemed to be attacking the base from all directions. Listening through headphones, Zach sat waiting in his cockpit, watching several members of base security rushing across the field as, one by one, they contained each of the 5 offenders before they could reach the runway. It all happened so fast. In less than 5 minutes, 3 men were killed and 2 were taken into custody, although not without a fight. And then chaos ensued. Fire erupted from Hawk Benton's bomber that had been ready to depart, and moments later, after hearing another explosion, Zach realized he'd apparently been hit by gunfire as well. "Hold back, that's an order," Captain Matthews roared, as Zach noticed other team members moving away from their planes, everyone ready to jump into action. Captain Matthews must have decided it was too dangerous of a situation, Zach figured. The last thing they needed right now were more casualties after losing Hawk Benton, the pilot of the Raptor that had just blown up. Airman Luke Bryant, who'd been next in line after Zach to depart, obviously had been unable to hear Captain Matthews' orders because after climbing out of his Raptor's cockpit, he was working frantically to open Josh's cockpit door. The fire seemed to spread in a heartbeat. As Josh's bomber became caught up in flames, Captain Matthews came rushing across the airfield while Josh kept attempting to escape from the cockpit. But the temperature inside the plane was becoming scalding hot, and when the instrument panel failed to work, probably due to the heat, Josh pounded at the door, trying to get the jammed controls to respond. "It's the heat," Luke shouted, continuing to pry at the door with a crowbar one of the mechanics had brought over in his hand. As Captain Matthews arrived at the scene, Zach heard Luke screaming, "It's screwing up the instrument panel and Zach's stuck inside." Somehow, Luke finally managed to wedge the cockpit open, and when he reached inside to pull him out, Captain Matthews held back the burning cockpit door. Zach felt like the flesh was on fire and was unable to move as Captain Matthews assisted Luke with pulling him out. Zach heard a loud crack, and then someone cried loudly in pain, and the last thing he remembered was being hauled away from the scene by Captain Matthews. Zach knew he was being airlifted out because someone had awoken and was screaming in agony. Wait a minute, maybe it was him. No, not all the moans and screams were coming from Zach. Someone else appeared to have been severely injured as well. But he couldn't turn his head to see who it was because something was wrapped around his neck and he appeared to be latched in place, probably so he wouldn't move around. And he was hooked up to something. There was a tube wedged into his throat. Oxygen. That's right, his lungs. The last few minutes before losing consciousness, he'd been barely able to breathe. Dozing, Zach found his mind drifting, returning to the past and the same recurring nightmare he'd been having for years, ever since he'd taken on his first covert assignment working with a search and rescue unit in Afghanistan. Drugged and tortured, there were so many pieces of his captivity still missing from his brain. Zach never knew for sure whether his nightmares were based on reality or delusions from his hazy memory. They had been drawn into a trap, and Zach had never been able to discover why he'd been the only person left alive. That was his last cognizant thought, and a moment later, Zach lost consciousness. Zach was awakened suddenly by the pain, and glancing down he noticed IV tubes seemed to be running out of him everywhere, while parts of his body were swathed in some kind of strange bandage. He seemed to be pretty heavily sedated, but bits of conversation in English, along with a vaguely recognizable second language, floated into his consciousness as he struggled to understand what was happening. He must be in a German hospital, he figured, because alternative services had been established at the makeshift air base in Iraq for transporting injured service people from emergency situations. How long he'd been there? He couldn't say. It must have been several days, he decided as his eyes swept through the sterile hospital room. Panicking, Zach suddenly heard a voice overhead. "Hello, Lieutenant. I'm Magda, and I'm one of the team who's been taking care of you. You've been in critical care for your burns for over 2 weeks now. Although it probably doesn't seem like it, your condition is improving. The best thing you can do is try and rest." Zach wasn't sure if he'd been given additional drugs for the pain, but he couldn't keep his eyes open any longer. Zach awakened to the sound of familiar voices talking softly in his room. Zach murmured, "Mom?" Sure enough, it was his mom leaning over his bed, studying him intently. "Zach, do you know where you are?" "Germany," he answered. "Hey, there's no more tube in my mouth, but geez, my throat is sore." "They just took it out." Zach's father, the colonel, was now standing next to Mom. "I'm glad to see you talking, even though you're croaking like a frog. You sure had us worried." Zach said hoarsely, "I'll admit, I was a little worried myself. How long have you been here?" "Nearly a week now," Mom answered. "I'm on an indefinite leave of absence," Dad said. "I'm not going back to work until we have you situated on a plane going back to the US." "I'm glad you're both here," Zach said softly, his eyes suddenly closing. Nearly a month later, Zach was being flown back to the States to the Veterans Hospital in DC for his final checkup after his initial healing period. Future surgeries along with skin grafting procedures were being recommended because of the severity and location of his burns. The sooner, the better, Zach had been told. Supposedly, he was lucky, but after the sight of his scarred neck and body in the mirror, it was hard for Zach to agree. But now he was going through a slew of emotions. At least he was up and moving around, ready to move forward, while Luke Bryant was stuck in the hospital in Germany, indefinitely. Zach was concerned about Luke. Not only was he in bad shape physically, his leg had been amputated, but his mental state was going to be questionable as well once he completely understood what was happening. Luke was 10 years younger than Zach, and Zach was having trouble himself accepting his own limitations. Since Luke had been planning on making the Air Force his career, how would he adapt? But Zach needed to consider his own recovery, and supposedly Luke had lots of support back in the States. So for now, Zach needed to concentrate on getting well himself. Zach had been able to speak with Luke before he'd left the hospital, but Luke was still in and out of consciousness from the painkillers, even though he'd finally been upgraded from critical condition. He was improving, although much more slowly than Zach because of the amputation. Zach probably wouldn't be alive if it weren't for Luke, so he'd move forward as best as he could. Hopefully, he'd have an opportunity to show Luke how grateful he was someday. Provided Zach could feel appreciated to be alive himself eventually, once he decided how to go on with his life. He was definitely feeling depressed about the future. At 36 years old, he had planned on the Air Force being his career, just like his father, since 3 generations of Logans had served proudly. But working in an office had never appealed much to Zach, so maybe after 18 years it was time to consider retirement. Especially if he had to go through all the surgeries he'd been told he'd need. Although he'd come close once, he'd never been married, so most of the money he'd earned had been put into savings and investments, since he'd never lived in one place for long. And his parents were not exactly destitute either. They would do anything for their only child. Zach's father had even told him years earlier that he didn't expect Zach to follow in his footsteps, which was unusual considering his dad was pretty far up in the chain of command. Puzzled at the time, Zach suspected his mom might have had something to do with his father, telling Zach that he'd be proud of him no matter what he decided to do about his future. Concerned about the lack of motivation for recovery, Mom and Dad had stuck around the entire month to make sure Zach was doing what he was supposed to do to aid in the healing process. Until now, Zach had never realized just how alone he really was. When he was younger, he had assumed by age 35 he'd have a wife and family. It wasn't just that he'd never met the right woman, but he didn't really have any other interests besides the Air Force and flying. So it would be up to him to find something that would interest him enough to plan his future. Chapter 1. 3 months later, New Orleans, Louisiana. His cousin, Mark Logan, was waiting to pick him up inside the airport after Zach disembarked from his plane. In his mid-20s, Mark was a grad student who had also started teaching. Mark approached Zach in the airport, and after grabbing one of Zach's carry-ons, he shook Zach's hand. "I would have known you anywhere, man, even with a beard," Mark murmured. "Everyone keeps telling me we look so much alike." Zach grinned. "Frankly, I don't see it." "Me neither," Mark answered, grinning as he led the way. Zach couldn't get over it. Despite not having a beard and being much slimmer, Mark looked enough like him to be a younger twin. "I figured we'd go straight to the house. I've already been forewarned that you're not taking it easy like you're supposed to after surgery." Zach grimaced as they walked aside toward the parking lot. "I have so many more surgeries to go. I can't survive with sitting still for long." Pointing at a truck, Mark muttered, "I can't believe I haven't seen you for over 10 years. You were my idol, you know." Zach waited for Mark to unlock the truck, and after throwing his bag into the back seat, he sat in the passenger seat. "I thought about you a lot when I was overseas. To tell you the truth, I kind of hoped you'd change your mind about enlisting." Mark laid the bag he'd been carrying beside the other before slipping behind the wheel of the truck. "You tried so hard to teach me how to defend myself. I'm still an uncoordinated klutz. Even Dad was relieved when I decided to go to college instead." Zach laughed as Mark revved up the engine, backing up in the parking lot and steering toward the exit. "I can't believe I haven't been back here since Katrina," Zach murmured. "You never really liked living here, did you?" Mark asked as they reached US 90 and began traveling east. "It's not that I didn't like it," Zach answered, giving Mark a side glance. "New Orleans is pretty cool. It's the house. Every time I'm staying there, I'm kind of creeped out, and it was 10 times worse when I was a kid. Most kids are unhappy when they have to move, but I was actually glad when Dad ended up transferring to Virginia and then Atlanta before he was deployed again." "Did you stay at the house last time you were here?" Mark asked, looking puzzled. "After Katrina, I did," Zach answered. "That's when I got rid of the twin-sized bed in my room and moved in a queen size from upstairs." Mark nodded. "I was away at school. I offered to come home, but Dad wouldn't have it." Zach answered. "It was a mess. We had emergency personnel staying at the house." Mark continued. "Our home, along with the 3 others down the lane, are located at the highest elevation in the area, which is why the house has been standing as long as it has. Our ancestors worked with various construction engineers through the years to ensure that the property remained above the sea level." Becoming thoughtful, Zach answered, "I didn't understand that until Katrina. I know the property has been in the family for over 150 years, so it's something we want to hold on to, but I'm really glad that your parents moved in to take care of the place after we moved away. It was a dream come true for me, Mark muttered. I can't wait for you to see the plans I've drawn up for remodeling the place. Your mom and dad figured it would keep you busy helping me decide whether everything I'm thinking about doing is feasible. You know, Mark, that's something that would work for me. I have some construction experience from when I was employed at a local lumber yard in Atlanta during high school. I really enjoyed it too.